U.S. Navy hospital ships anchor offshore. Hundreds of Japanese POWs, thin, sick, and silent, watch as American doctors unload crates of plasma, penicillin, and bandages. The irony is immediate. They are about to receive care that imperial policy often withheld from Allied captives. When contrasting POW treatment, this refers specifically to Imperial Japanese Army and Navy practices in particular theaters. Treatment varied by unit, time, and supply conditions. American doctors waste medicine on prisoners, our men get bullets, noted in a captured officer's diary, translated 1942, tone paraphrased, exact wording varies by source. Long before Japanese soldiers found themselves staring at the white hulls of U.S. hospital ships, imperial doctrine had written their fate in advance. To the Japanese high command, medicine was a weapon to be rationed and directed toward combat power. Soldiers who bled for the emperor deserved priority. Prisoners, by definition dishonorable, deserved little more than containment. Gen. Hideki Tojo, both war minister and later prime minister, embodied this ethos in official policy. Under his administration, logistics favored ammunition and rations for active battalions over humanitarian resources for captives. In the field, this translated into brutal triage. Wounded prisoners were often abandoned, while scarce quinine or sulfa drugs went to Japanese units still able to fight. By contrast, U.S. forces entered the war bound by Geneva Convention obligations and reinforced by a cultural emphasis on medical care as a universal duty. Rear Admiral Charles Lockwood, commander of U.S. submarines in the Pacific, noted bitterly that many of his men, captured alive, would not return from Japanese hands. Yet when his submariners pulled Japanese sailors from the sea, corpsmen were instructed to disinfect wounds, splint bones, and log every treatment. Numbers told the story starkly. Between 130,000 and 140,000 Allied prisoners fell into Japanese custody across Asia and the Pacific. Mortality rates averaged 25–30%, though the figure swung higher on the Burma-Thailand Railway, where jungle, cholera, and exhaustion cut down thousands. By contrast, Axis prisoners in American hands, including Japanese by the war's end, experienced mortality rates below 1%. Geneva-compliant rations, routine vaccinations, and inspections by the International Red Cross ensured survival was the norm, not the exception. The gap widened further as U.S. industrial power scaled up. By 1945, American pharmaceutical plants churned out billions of units of penicillin each month. Supplies were so abundant that even enemy POWs received doses for infections that imperial doctors struggled to treat with herbal substitutes or dwindling quinine stockpiles. Japanese rations told their own tale. By late 1944, soldiers in many theaters subsisted on 1,500–2,000 calories a day, barely enough for men expected to march and fight in tropical heat. Supply lines stretched thin. From Manila to Tokyo was roughly 1,800 miles. Allied blockade and submarine warfare further strangled shipments, leaving garrisons short of everything from rice to bandages. Captured diaries and Kempeitai field reports revealed how imperial officers viewed enemy POWs. One officer scoffed that Americans were weak men for treating prisoners as if they mattered. Another noted disdainfully that U.S. medics wasted supplies on the captured instead of husbanding them for more worthy causes. These are paraphrased from surviving translations. Exact wording varied, but the tone was consistent. Medical mercy equaled weakness. It is vital to note that not every Japanese officer or unit behaved identically. Some camp commandants permitted limited medical aid. Others enforced neglect, or worse. Treatment varied sharply by command, theater, and period. The Burma-Thailand Railway, for instance, became synonymous with starvation and malaria, while camps in the home islands sometimes maintained more stable rations. The ideology behind such practices was rooted in the Bushido Code as adapted for modern war. Surrender equaled disgrace, and disgrace negated entitlement to care. The wounded enemy had chosen dishonor. Sparing medical supplies for him threatened the fighting strength of Japan's own forces. Jin Shiroishi, commander of the notorious Unit 731, exemplified this instrumental view of medicine. To Ishii, prisoners were test subjects for biological warfare, not patients. His unit experimented with pathogens, frostbite, and vivisection, warped extensions of the same logic that denied POWs medical dignity elsewhere. In practice, neglect could be as lethal as overt brutality. Malaria went untreated in tropical camps. Dysentery spread unchecked in unsanitary barracks. Forced marches, such as those in the Philippines, pushed weakened men beyond survival. A bullet was not always necessary. Disease and starvation sufficed. Meanwhile, U.S. authorities enforced a radically different standard. Red Cross packages reached German, Italian, and later Japanese prisoners held in camps across America. Prisoners underwent regular medical inspections, received dental care, and were vaccinated. American officers justified this not only on humanitarian grounds but also as strategic leverage. A healthy enemy prisoner might yield intelligence, a dead one offered nothing. The irony deepened when propaganda leaflets dropped over Pacific battlefields promised food, water, and medical treatment to any Japanese soldier who surrendered. Few believed it at first. Indoctrination warned them Americans would torture or kill. Yet by 1945, thousands of captured Japanese would learn the offer had been genuine. Thus the contradiction was set well before surrender. Imperial officers mocked America for its softness, for wasting precious supplies on men no longer fit to fight, yet by war's end, that same softness would prove the only reason thousands of Japanese soldiers lived to see home again. The same diary that derided American doctors as wasteful reads today as a grim prelude. The officer who dismissed mercy as weakness could not have imagined that 3 years later, his comrades would be lining up at American hospitals for injections of penicillin, life-saving medicine Japan could not provide. The irony was cruel but undeniable. What imperial doctrine treated as weakness became the one force more durable than steel or gunpowder. Medical mercy. The waste scorned in 1942 was the scaffold of survival in 1945. Salt, sweat, and cordite clung to the deck as the first Japanese sailors were hauled aboard a U.S. destroyer off Guadalcanal, shivering, wounded, expecting bayonets. The Solomon Islands campaign marked the first major ground offensive by U.S. forces in the Pacific. At sea, the Battle of Savo Island on August 9, 1942, left more than 1,000 Allied sailors dead, a staggering toll in a single night action. Amid the wreckage, scattered Japanese survivors were pulled from the water by American ships. For many U.S. sailors, this was the first time they had come face to face with Japanese prisoners. The men dragged across the gunwales were gaunt, bruised, some bleeding from shrapnel. Their eyes darted nervously, waiting for the blow they had been told would come. Admiral Frank Jack Fletcher, who commanded carriers in the early campaign, pressed for strict adherence to U.S. Navy policy. Enemy prisoners, once captured, would be treated humanely, examined by medical officers, and secured. This stood in sharp contrast to the treatment Allied prisoners often experienced once in Japanese hands. Among those responsible for carrying out these procedures was Capt. Howard Bode, an officer involved in the desperate night actions off Guadalcanal. His command, like many others, faced the chaos of battle, followed almost immediately by the responsibility of tending to enemy wounded. It was a jarring shift. Minutes after shells had torn through Allied decks, corpsmen were disinfecting the burns of the very men who had helped fire them. Language posed its own challenge. A junior-grade naval interpreter, records sometimes leave only rank, not name, stood on deck translating rapid-fire exchanges, trying to calm terrified sailors who could not believe the food and bandages were real. Those early captures were small in number. In the first year of the Pacific War, only dozens of Japanese POWs made it into U.S. custody. The scale remained modest until 1945, when surrender brought hundreds of thousands under Allied control. But even those first groups revealed a pattern. Once stabilized in forward bases, prisoners were transferred vast distances, 6,000, 7,000 miles, via Hawaii and San Francisco, to inland camps such as Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, and Camp Huntsville, Texas. The voyage itself became a study in contrasts. Men who had expected bayonets now received medical checkups on troop ships, vaccines against smallpox and typhoid, and regulated meals. Caution note, these numbers were small compared to the later flood of POWs after surrender. The narrative of mass capture in 1942-43 should be read as relative, dozens or hundreds, not tens of thousands. The bureaucratic imprint of these first captures is unmistakable. U.S. Navy action reports from Guadalcanal detail not only gunnery results, but also the condition of enemy survivors. Corpsmen logged temperatures, noted wounds, and administered sulfa drugs. Later, when prisoners arrived at U.S. facilities, POW intake logs recorded blood pressure, weight, vaccination history, and diet. At Camp McCoy, new arrivals were placed in quarantine for medical observation, procedures strikingly similar to those undergone by American recruits themselves. At the time, Panamamese Sycamindid Tories objected to the West secession as dishonoring, locating it as propaganda, even though J.L. Weeder, a fellow PLP, strikingly similar to those undergone by American recruits themselves. Post-war recollections highlight the psychological rupture these men experienced. One Japanese petty officer, interviewed decades later, remembered his shock. "We expected bayonets, not bandages." This phrasing is paraphrased from translated recollections, but the essence remained consistent across testimonies. They had been told that surrender meant torture or execution. Instead, they found orderlies with thermometers, needles, and food trays. To men raised under Bushido codes that equated capture with dishonor, the very act of being treated as human created a cognitive dissonance as sharp as any wound. Here the numbers diverged most starkly. In U.S. camps, prisoners ate meals averaging around 3,000 calories a day, depending on ration cycles. They received vaccinations, dental care, and access to infirmaries. Mortality across all Axis POWs in U.S. custody remained under 1%. By contrast, in imperial camps across Burma, the Philippines, and New Guinea, prisoners struggled with malaria and dysentery that went untreated or received only minimal attention. Allied POW mortality, under Japanese control, averaged 25–30%, rising dramatically in areas of acute supply crisis. Contrast pair, where American camps ran routine health checks with caloric stability, imperial field camps often left men to deteriorate under starvation and disease. The irony was brutal. Men indoctrinated from their first days of training to believe surrender was shameful discovered that their only chance at survival was precisely through that dishonor. Their own command had mocked mercy as weakness, yet it was American weakness that preserved them. The Japanese Navy petty officers who staggered onto U.S. destroyer decks in 1942 could not know it, but their survival odds had already flipped. Captivity under American care meant a statistical certainty of survival. Captivity under their own system, had roles been reversed, would likely have meant deterioration or death. On those decks off Guadalcanal, the first contradictions of the war became visible in human form. Salt-stained sailors expecting death received plasma. The first hesitant prisoners began a journey not only of thousands of miles across the Pacific, but also across the chasm between indoctrination and reality. What had been mocked as weakness now revealed itself as the only path to endurance. By mid-1944, thousands of Japanese POWs had received U.S. hospital care across the Pacific, a reality their own command had deemed unthinkable. As the war stretched deeper into its third year, the U.S. Army Medical Department, guided by the Surgeon General's office in Washington, extended its reach across every theater. Dozens of base hospitals dotted Hawaii, New Guinea, the Philippines, and later the Marianas. At least 20 facilities, at various times, admitted not only Allied wounded, but also Japanese POWs, some of whom had been captured in combat, others abandoned by their own units. Douglas MacArthur, overseeing Southwest Pacific Area operations, ordered that POWs be medically screened and stabilized. The order wasn't sentimental, it was pragmatic. Geneva Convention standards demanded it, and healthier captives were more likely to provide usable information during interrogation. The common killers were the same: malaria, dysentery, and tropical ulcers. Left untreated, they hollowed out soldiers within weeks. With Allied medicine, however, recovery windows shortened dramatically. 3 to 6 weeks under routine hospital care, provided nutrition and quinine or atibrin were available. Medical reports show hundreds to thousands of malaria cases treated among Japanese POWs in 1943–44. Corpsmen recorded the same treatments they administered to American troops: measured doses of anti-malarial tablets, bed rest, IV fluids, and high-calorie meals. Atibrin, a synthetic drug, had become a cornerstone of U.S. anti-malarial policy. It stained the skin a yellow hue, but it worked. For Japanese prisoners accustomed to herbal decoctions or intermittent quinine, when supplies even existed, the difference between the two regimes could mean life or death. A typical intake began with delousing and quarantine. POWs were logged by name, rank, and condition. Medical staff noted weight loss, recorded fevers, checked blood pressure, and vaccinated for smallpox and typhoid. Provisioning for their care appeared in U.S. Army budgets as regular lined item support, the same bureaucratic language that governed rations for Allied soldiers. Doctors and nurses did not need to argue each case. The system assumed their obligation to treat. In contrast, Imperial Japanese field hospitals, such as those scattered along the Burma-Thailand Railway, often functioned without reliable drug supply chains. Japanese soldiers themselves went without, prisoners fared worse. Improvised herbal teas or topical salves substituted for antibiotics that never arrived. U.S. Army Medical Corps reports from 1943–44 detail hospitalization rates among POWs. The records are clinical, stripped of sentiment. Tables list: number of Japanese POWs admitted, 76, malaria, 42, dysentery, 18, trauma. Another summary tallied the cost of bandages, sulfa drugs, and calories. The numbers confirm what memoirs later remembered. Prisoners who would have wasted away in jungle stockades instead lived through weeks of monitored care. An American Army nurse, recalling her wartime service decades later in an oral history interview, described her role simply: "We treated them like men, even if they would never have done the same for ours." She did not add bitterness, but the memory lingered. For her, the work had been routine. For the prisoners, it was bewildering. On the other side, staff officers such as Col Kenerio Sato, who helped shape Imperial Army policy, viewed prisoner care as a misallocation of resources. Japanese reports noted that rations should be directed first to frontline units. Hospitals for POWs were not even formally resourced in most theaters. Captured documents show that Imperial planners considered high mortality among enemy captives unfortunate but unavoidable. It was a philosophy of triage on a national scale. Life was measured only in terms of continued military utility. The disparity was stark. In American hospitals, penicillin for wound infections, atibrin for malaria, sulfa drugs for bacterial illnesses, 3 meals a day tailored to build weight. In Japanese forward hospitals, herbal infusions and poultices in place of antibiotics. Malaria, treated with rest and meager rice rations. Hachette, prisoners often lying side by side with untreated wounds, septic fevers rising. Contrast pair, American pharmacological resources dwarfed Japanese improvisations, producing recovery instead of attrition. Ironically, this medical mercy carried strategic dividends. Survivors sometimes talked. A prisoner who had survived his fever or surgery was more likely to reveal details about supply depots, tactics, or morale. Humane treatment, dismissed as weakness by the imperial system, turned into an unexpected intelligence tool. Inversely, Japan's neglect of Allied POWs often yielded silence. Starved and dying men could offer little under interrogation. Brutality became its own dead end. Caution. Note: not all POW care translated into cooperation. Many Japanese prisoners, even after recovery, refused to speak, their indoctrination intact. Others gave misleading or fragmentary answers. Interrogation outcomes varied widely depending on personality, time in captivity, and the slow erosion of cultural taboos. The point remains: American hospitals offered the possibility of recovery. Japanese facilities, particularly in Southeast Asia, rarely did. By mid-1944, the ledger of mercy was written not in words, but in charts. Temperatures lowered, wounds sutured, malaria arrested, calories restored. Each entry in a hospital logbook told a story of survival that imperial doctrine had considered worthless. The irony grew sharper with every patient. America's waste of medicine was turning into one of its quietest weapons. While Japanese officers had scoffed that healing enemies betrayed weakness, the healed enemies themselves bore living testimony that mercy could conquer where cruelty failed. Texas. Train doors clanged open. Bewildered Japanese POWs stepped into sunlight, greeted by medics with clipboards and stethoscopes. By the time Japanese POWs reached the American mainland, they had already traveled farther than most of them could have imagined in their lifetimes. Captured in the steaming jungles of the Solomons or the beaches of the Marianas, they were processed through forward bases, shipped thousands of miles across the Pacific, and disembarked on the U.S. West Coast. From there, trains rolled them deep into the interior. The first sight of America was not barbed wire or rifle barrels, it was doctors. Camps like Huntsville, Texas, McCoy, Wisconsin, and Lordsburg, New Mexico, each received contingents of Japanese prisoners. These were small compared to the masses of Germans and Italians, but the cultural shock was immense. America had constructed a vast system for handling Axis prisoners, 45 to 50 major camps across the continental United States, with branch camps in farming regions and industrial zones. The system's total capacity exceeded 400,000 Axis POWs, overwhelmingly German and Italian. Japanese prisoners were a minority, perhaps 5,000 in all, but their presence was highly visible to the men themselves. For them, capture had been foretold as a death sentence. Instead, they stepped into camps designed like small cities: barracks, mess halls, infirmaries, recreation fields, libraries. And always, at the entry point, the medical stations. Upon arrival, prisoners lined up for intake. Army doctors and corpsmen measured blood pressure, logged weight, inspected teeth. Vaccinations followed: typhoid, smallpox, sometimes tetanus. Prisoners who had lived on rice and dried fish now swallowed balanced meals, 3,000 calories a day, according to Geneva standards, though actual rations varied with supply cycles. The routine was disorienting. Men who had endured jungle marches without clean water now found themselves ordered to brush teeth, bathe, and present for regular medical checks. To American officers, this was procedure. To Japanese prisoners, it felt like a collapse of everything they had been taught. One Japanese veteran, interviewed decades later in a translated memoir, recalled, "It was shameful to live because they saved us." The statement captured the deep ambivalence many felt. Survival carried stigma. To be nursed back to health by the enemy compounded the dishonor of capture itself. Yet shame was interlaced with astonishment. Some admitted they had been impressed by the orderliness of American facilities. Others remembered the strangeness of dental drills or the surreal sensation of receiving eyeglasses for the first time in their lives. The paper trail confirmed these impressions. U.S. Army Provost Marshal General reports detailed the medical processing of Axis POWs. Camp Huntsville's records showed near-universal compliance. Every prisoner screened, vaccinated, and logged. Camp McCoy's intake books included dental records and treatment summaries written in the same cursive hand that tracked American soldiers. The intent was bureaucratic, not sentimental. Yet the bureaucracy itself conveyed a message. Every life, even the enemy's, had to be recorded, counted, and maintained. When censorship allowed, Japanese prisoners wrote letters home. Unlike German POWs, who often described work assignments or soccer matches, Japanese letters frequently emphasized medical experiences. They described inoculations, clean barracks, and strange foods. For families still rationing scraps in Japan, these descriptions seemed surreal, sometimes even unbelievable. Caution note: not all letters reached home. Camp policies varied, and censorship blocked many details. Some families never received word at all, while others received only carefully redacted summaries. The contrast with imperial custody could not have been sharper. Allied prisoners in Japanese camps often struggled with chronic malaria and dysentery left untreated, wounds that festered, and rations that dwindled to starvation levels. In Burma and the Philippines, survival was often measured in weeks. Meanwhile, in America, Japanese prisoners lined up for vaccinations and 3 meals a day. It was not paradise. They remained captives, watched by guards, fenced in by wire, but the baseline of survival was secure. Mortality in U.S. custody remained under 1%. Contrast pair. German POWs wrote of soccer matches and farm labor. Japanese POWs wrote, when allowed, of medical checks and vaccinations. For men raised in a culture that considered surrender worse than death, the experience of being systematically cared for was its own shock. This system did not arise by chance. Gen. George C. Marshall, U.S. Army Chief of Staff, supported a policy of adhering to Geneva standards for all Axis prisoners. The logic was twofold: protecting captured Americans abroad, even if reciprocity was rare, and upholding American moral standing. For Marshall, and for the War Department as a whole, the medical treatment of POWs was part of America's self-purity. Discipline, not vengeance, was the rule. Every prisoner fed and inoculated was another example of America demonstrating the values it claimed to defend. For Japanese POWs, the experience was destabilizing. They had been conditioned to expect cruelty. Instead, they found order and routine care. The shock was psychological as much as physical. Soldiers raised on tales of American barbarity discovered that their enemy's discipline included keeping them alive. The irony was sharp. Those who had laughed at American softness now survived because of it. The daily humiliation was not just captivity, but survival itself. Proof that the enemy's mercy, not imperial toughness, kept them breathing. After the war, reintegration varied. Some former POWs returned home embittered, ashamed of survival. Others, however, became bridges in U.S.-Japan reconciliation. They spoke of the American camps as orderly, even humane, and helped soften perceptions in post-war Japan. There were no uniform outcomes. Some remained silent, unwilling to reopen old wounds. Others wrote memoirs, gave interviews, and recalled the surreal moment the train doors opened in Texas and the first stethoscopes appeared. On American soil, the clash of doctrines became unavoidable. Men taught to see mercy as dishonor now confronted it daily. At the mess hall, the infirmary, the vaccination line. Their survival depended on the very practice their officers had scorned. The clang of train doors in Texas marked more than a change of scenery. It marked the collision of two moral worlds, one that exalted death and one that insisted even the enemy must be kept alive. In a POW ward, the clean sheets unnerved more than pain. The kindness itself did not fit the code. For generations, Japanese military culture had been steeped in the adapted Bushido ethos: death before dishonor, death before surrender. Captivity meant not only personal disgrace, but a stain on one's family. To live at the mercy of the enemy was a fate worse than death itself. Yet in American hands, captured soldiers awoke to realities that mocked the code. Instead of starvation, they received rations. Instead of disease-ridden mats, they lay in wards with white sheets. Instead of abandonment, they were examined by doctors, who seemed to care more for their survival than their own commanders had. The dissonance was unbearable. For many, the first taste of soup or the prick of a vaccination needle carried not gratitude, but shame. Survival itself had become a psychological battlefield. Nowhere was the contrast sharper than in the Philippines. In April 1942, after the fall of Batahan, some 60,000–70,000 Filipino soldiers and about 10,000 Americans were forced into a march of 65 miles under blistering heat and minimal water. Thousands died. Filipino casualties numbered in the thousands. Around 600–650 Americans perished. This event, remembered as the Bataan Death March, seared itself into Allied memory as a symbol of Japanese cruelty. Survivors recalled beatings, bayonet stabbings, and men collapsing by the roadside. Medical care was nearly non-existent. Contrast that with the fate of Japanese prisoners taken by the U.S. around the same time. Their journey of 65 miles was not on foot under guard, but by ambulance or truck, driven to base hospitals for treatment. The comparison is illustrative, symbolic, of two systems whose distance was measured not only in miles, but in values. Allied interrogation transcripts from 1943 and 1944 revealed the psychological strain of captivity. Prisoners, once recovered from fevers or wounds, often confessed confusion rather than relief. They admitted disbelief that Americans would waste food or medicine on men who no longer fought. Occupation-era interviews after the war returned to the same theme. Disbelief turned to reluctant acceptance, and in some cases, to re-evaluation of the enemy. A former sergeant recalled that the enemy's mercy was heavier than a sword. His words, recorded in translation, carried the weight of contradiction. Luzder Pride, Masaharu Homa, commander of the Philippines campaign, faced trial after the war for atrocities committed under his command. His testimony, while legalistic, included a telling admission. He had not expected Americans would treat Japanese POWs better than some imperial units treated Allied captives. He acknowledged logistical failures, command breakdowns, and loss of control, but the unspoken comparison was clear. Captain Eugene C. Jacobs, an American medical officer captured on Bataan, later wrote of treating fellow POWs with almost no supplies. His recollections stood as a grim ledger of scarcity: quinine absent, bandages improvised, starvation unavoidable. His memory sharpened the contrast. Americans had endured neglect under Japanese guard, while Japanese prisoners in U.S. hands received care as policy. The irony was not lost on historians. John W. Dower, in his later cultural analysis, described how American humanitarian norms unintentionally became a wrecking ball against the Bushido ethos. What America considered routine, the Geneva obligation to provide food and medicine, became in the eyes of captured Japanese an ideological assault. Leaflets dropped by Allied planes reinforced the message. By war's end, millions of surrender leaflets fluttered across Pacific battlefields, promising food, water, and medical care. The promise was not propaganda alone, it reflected reality. For men indoctrinated to expect death, this created a seed of doubt that gnawed at the edges of their resolve. Interviews conducted after the war revealed a recurring theme: shame. A majority of former POWs expressed that survival itself carried a burden. To owe one's life to the enemy was almost intolerable. One recalled, "It was better to have died, but I am here because they healed me." Such testimonies, paraphrased in translation, echoed across oral histories. The paradox was inescapable. The only reason many lived was because their enemy had violated the very logic of Bushido. Caution note: not all Japanese POWs experienced a collapse of ethos. Some remained steadfast, refusing to speak, withdrawing into silence, or holding to the belief that survival was dishonorable. Others shifted only gradually, reevaluating after the war, when repatriation and family reunions softened the shame of captivity. The psychological collapse was not universal. It was fragmented, individual, uneven, sometimes hidden, but it was undeniable that the system of American mercy forced every prisoner to confront contradictions their own doctrine had never prepared them to resolve. Numbers underscored the gulf. In U.S. custody, POW survival exceeded 99%. In Japanese custody, Allied prisoners died by the tens of thousands. For Americans, feeding and healing the enemy was routine policy. For Japan, denying care was often a wartime necessity. Contrast pair. Bushido exalted death before capture. America's ethos preserved even enemy life. One doctrine demanded extinction, the other enforced survival. The irony cut deep. America's routine humanitarian policy, intended simply to comply with international law, became the most potent ideological weapon in the Pacific War. Mercy, derided as weakness, now undermined the moral scaffolding of the imperial system. Captured Japanese soldiers, lying on clean sheets they could not reconcile with their training, lived long enough to testify to the collapse. Their survival was proof that the code was not unbreakable. In the stillness of POW wards, the battle for meaning replaced the clash of arms. Clean sheets became symbols heavier than bayonets. Rice bowls and vaccinations proved more subversive than leaflets. The empire had demanded that its soldiers embrace death. The enemy demanded that they live. The result was not uniform conversion, but fracture. In every soldier's mind, a private reckoning began. If mercy was dishonor, then why was dishonor the only path to survival? Tokyo, 1945. Bombed-out hospitals. Morphine gone. Offshore, U.S. hospital ships unloading penicillin and plasma. By the summer of 1945, Japan's cities were in ashes. Firebombing raids had gutted Tokyo, Osaka, and Nagoya. Hospitals that had once served as pillars of urban health were shells, their wards blackened, their stocks of morphine, sulfa, and gauze long since exhausted. Doctors struggled to treat patients with herbal poultices, rice gruel, and scraps of cloth boiled again and again. Civilian suffering compounded military collapse. Tuberculosis spread rapidly among evacuees. Malnutrition stunted children. Even physicians admitted that the wounded often died, not from the severity of their injuries, but from the absence of the simplest medicines. Against this backdrop, the sight of white-painted American hospital ships off Yokohama Harbor was surreal. Among them was the USS Benevolence, AH-13, with capacity for roughly 1,000 patients. Its holds carried crates of plasma, penicillin, and quinine, supplies so abundant that the surplus could be directed not only to American troops but to enemy POWs and civilians alike. Within weeks of Japan's formal surrender in September 1945, hundreds of tons of medical supplies were landed. U.S. Army records confirmed that the initial shipments included bandages, sulfa drugs, surgical kits, and entire warehouses worth of penicillin. The numbers varied by manifest, but the scale was undeniable. In the first phase alone, shipments exceeded 100 tons, dwarfing the capacity of Japan's remaining pharmaceutical network. Rail corridors from Yokohama to Tokyo, about 25 miles, became lifelines. Trains and trucks carried evacuees, many sick or malnourished, toward field clinics and occupation hospitals. Survivors described the scenes: gaunt families clustered by the tracks, hoping for transport, watching as convoys of American medics moved steadily toward the capital. At the center of this new order stood Gen. Douglas MacArthur, Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, SCAP. In his occupation directives, he made health and food security a cornerstone of rebuilding. One memorandum paraphrased his stance: a new Japan would be built on public health, food security, and life, not death. It was a deliberate inversion of wartime ethos. The Imperial Army had exalted sacrifice. MacArthur sought legitimacy through survival. By stabilizing the population, he could prevent unrest, stave off disease, and demonstrate that democracy's promise was more than rhetoric. The evidence lies in USS Benevolence manifests, which list cases of plasma, cartons of penicillin, and surgical gear by weight and number. SCAP health reports from late 1945 record tens of thousands of patients, both POWs and civilians, treated in the first 4 months of occupation. By December, the tally reached into the tens of thousands, a figure unprecedented in Japan's modern history for foreign-administered medical care. Occupation health officers noted the urgency. Many city hospitals were structurally intact, but stripped of supplies. American shipments reactivated wards almost overnight. To imply that all Japanese medicine collapsed would be misleading. Even amid the ruins, physicians worked tirelessly. Dr. Shigeaki Hinohara, who would later become one of Japan's leading public health reformers, began his post-war work in precisely these dire conditions. With little more than ingenuity and determination, he and colleagues improvised treatments, stretching scarce supplies to serve as many as possible. Caution note: occupation records risk painting too uniform a picture of collapse. In reality, Japan's medical profession did not vanish. It adapted under scarcity and immediately began absorbing new methods and supplies once occupation aid arrived. The contrasts were immediate and visible. On the streets of Tokyo, civilians scavenged weeds and bark to make herbal decoctions, echoing methods from centuries past. Offshore, American ships dispensed penicillin by the crate. Contrast pair, American medical convoys moved steadily into cities, re-establishing clinics with plasma and sulfa, while civilians queued with homegrown remedies in hand, desperate for anything that might stave off infection. For Japanese soldiers, the irony was sharper still. The same military machine that had experimented with pathogens under Unit 731 now found itself dependent on enemy antibiotics for survival. The rhetoric of purity and strength collapsed under the blunt reality of plasma bottles and hypodermic needles. The irony was as brutal as it was undeniable. An army that had treated prisoners as expendable now saw its own captured men, and even its civilians, kept alive by the very nation it had sought to destroy. Japanese propaganda had derided American softness as weakness. Now that softness was the scaffolding of survival. The spectacle undermined more than ideology. It rewrote lived experience. A soldier who had sworn to die for the emperor found himself instead stitched, injected, and fed by foreign hands. Each act of mercy challenged the indoctrination that had carried Japan into catastrophe. In the months that followed, SCAP made public health one of its most visible successes. Vaccination campaigns swept through schools, nutrition programs targeted children, penicillin shipments multiplied year by year. By 1946, Japanese doctors worked side by side with American counterparts, not only in hospitals, but in training programs that reshaped the nation's medical system. Figures from occupation reports emphasized the transformation: tens of thousands treated in the first months, hundreds of thousands reached by vaccination within a year. These numbers, though administrative, represented something more profound: the foundation of a Japan rebuilt not on the rhetoric of sacrifice, but on the infrastructure of survival. In the autumn of 1945, the rail lines from Yokohama carried more than evacuees. They carried a message. The war had ended not with extermination, but with medicine. The clean wards of American hospital ships and the convoys of plasma represented more than supplies. They embodied the collapse of an ethos that had prized death. In its place, a new Japan began, its survival paradoxically secured by the mercy of its former enemy. Decades later, Japanese veterans recalled their greatest shock was not defeat, but survival through American medicine. When the guns fell silent in 1945, many Japanese prisoners carried home memories sharper than battle itself. The most enduring was not the humiliation of capture, but the bewildering fact that they had survived because the enemy had healed them. For men raised to expect a bayonet after surrender, the clean sheets of U.S. hospitals became the defining irony of their war. The reckoning began almost immediately. At the Tokyo War Crimes Tribunal, testimony detailed the catastrophic conditions Allied prisoners endured in Japanese custody: starvation, untreated disease, the brutality of forced labor. In parallel, American officials submitted documentation showing how Axis prisoners, including Japanese, had received regular medical inspections, rations, and vaccinations. The contrast was deliberate. Mercy stood as evidence of moral superiority. But the International Red Cross, which had struggled to reach prisoners in Asia during the war, became a partner in post-war Japan. Its reports, in the late 1940s, highlighted American-led medical reforms, distribution of vaccines, re-establishment of clinics, and coordination with Japanese doctors, now free from military command. U.S. financial records show that occupation-era medical aid cost tens of millions of dollars between 1946 and 1948, a sum allocated to food shipments, vaccine production, and the vast imports of penicillin. The numbers were less important than their effect. Medicine once reserved for American soldiers now flowed steadily into Japanese hospitals. Penicillin shipments multiplied during those years. Sources described rapid expansion, doubling and redoubling as industrial production soared. By 1948, Japan's doctors had access to supplies they could hardly have imagined 3 years earlier, when herbal poultices were their only option. The impact on public health was visible by the end of the decade. Japanese mortality rates, long inflated by tuberculosis and malnutrition, fell sharply by 1950. The reasons were layered: vaccinations against smallpox and diphtheria, nutrition programs that reached schools, and sanitation reforms enforced by SCAP. Dr. Shigeaki Hinohara, who had begun his career in the leanest years of 1945, became one of the architects of Japan's medical renaissance. With American supplies and training programs, he pushed for a system that valued prevention, nutrition, and public health infrastructure. The physician who once improvised with scraps now worked in clinics stocked with antibiotics. Occupation reports list tens of thousands of patients treated in the first post-war months and far larger numbers reached by vaccination campaigns within 3 years. These statistics, drawn from SCAP health directives and Red Cross reports, were not just administrative. They marked a shift in how medicine functioned in Japanese society, from scarcity and triage to prevention and widespread access. For Japanese prisoners, the memory never faded. Oral histories recorded in the 1970s capture the paradox. "I learned that mercy can win wars long after the guns stop," one former POW reflected. His words, paraphrased in translation, summed up the lesson many carried. Survival was not humiliation, It was a revelation that strength could coexist with mercy. Memoirs diverged between nations. German POWs in American camps often wrote about sports leagues, farm labor, or cultural exchanges. Their recollections emphasized leisure and productivity. By contrast, Japanese POWs, when they spoke at all, returned to the subject of medicine. The vaccinations, the dental checks, the bandaged wounds, these details shocked them more than barbed wire or guard towers. Contrast pair. Where Germans emphasized the work and games of captivity, Japanese veterans emphasized the medical care that contradicted everything imperial doctrine had promised. The irony proved lasting. What imperial officials had mocked as weakness, feeding and healing prisoners, became one of America's most enduring soft power weapons. The narrative of mercy survived into memory, shaping how both occupiers and occupied remembered the war. U.S. Surgeon General Norman T. Kirk, head of the Army Medical Department, argued during occupation planning that medical aid was not just humanitarian, but strategic. Healthy populations were less prone to unrest. The fact that this policy also rewrote the moral terms of the Pacific War was an unintended but powerful side effect. Today, pieces of that story remain visible. Former POW and administrative sites, such as the Camp McCoy Museum in Wisconsin or exhibitions in Huntsville, Texas, preserve artifacts and documents from the era. Visitors can see medical logs, ration lists, and even photographs of Japanese prisoners receiving dental care. These fragments testify that mercy was not an anecdote, but a system, recorded line by line in government ledgers. The war ended in flames, but the memory many Japanese POWs carried home was not of fire. It was of injections, bandages, and rations given by an enemy they had been taught to despise. The final irony endured across decades. Survival itself had been a gift from those they had been told would kill them, and in that survival a lesson lingered. That mercy, dismissed as weakness, can outlast empires.